Lending more support to the needy, the government's sixth fiscal stimulus package, the People and Economic Strategic Empowerment Program, PERMEKASA, helping vulnerable groups, people with disabilities, and those who lost their jobs due to the pandemic. And more efforts underway to boost economic growth, support business, and continue targeted assistance to the people and sectors that are still affected.
PERMEKASA ini dengan nilai keseluruhan 20 bilion ringgit adalah satu lagi inisiatif Kerajaan Perikatan Nasional untuk meringankan beban yang sedang ditanggung oleh rakyat, mengukuhkan semula pertumbuhan ekonomi dan merancangkan aktiviti perniagaan. Kerajaan Perikatan Nasional
Good evening and welcome to another episode of Money Matters with me, Zahir Kelvin Ong Abdullah. We have in the studios with us today Finance Ministry's National Budget Director, Dato' Johan Mahmud Marikan. Thank you, Dato', for appearing again on Money Matters.
Well,
and the last time you were here, you did not receive your Dato'-ship award yet. So on behalf of the Money Matters team, we'd like to congratulate you for that.
Thank you, Kelvin. Good to be back.
Good to have you. What we saw earlier just now was the Prime Minister unveiling the 20 billion ringgit PERMEKASA assistance package. Can I start off by asking you that a lot of people have said that it has come at the right time, especially when the national COVID-19 vaccination program is being carried out. So it has been described as the right solutions for the people. So what were the challenges in preparing this latest aid package?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for this opportunity to explain. You know, as we were just talking just before coming on air, you know, how there are some commentators out there saying that, oh yes, yet another package. You alluded to there being already 6 packages. It's almost as though government wakes up, what's for breakfast, another package. And certainly that's not the case. And as you alluded to, that's certainly not the case that government's forever going to become like almost a welfare state, forever giving out in terms of perennial assistance. And I think what's important, I'd like to take opportunity just to explain, and you know, I think there's a visual which I hope to share. But what basically this tries to articulate is that over time, what the government really has had to do is really in battling COVID. It's really about over time, as you can see on screen, this is really a timeline going from left to right, from 2020 to 21. Right at the top was really our understanding of COVID. At the beginning, there were many unknowns. At that time, we thought it wouldn't be even as damaging as SARS. Over time, we had to learn from experience, we've improved our SOPs, but today we have the wealth of data and the better understanding of COVID. But going back to then last year, and what you see, that dark blue shape is really, at the beginning, almost all sectors were closed during MCO. So very few sectors were open. And with that, the bottom part is really about the assistance packages. And so when almost all sectors were closed, Prihatin had to involve Bantuan Prihatin Rakyat for both B40 and M40, automatic loan moratorium for everyone, and wage subsidy for all sectors. But as we understood COVID better, and in terms of how to better balance between life and livelihoods, we were then able to then implement MCO2 this year, where you allowed more sectors to open. And with that, you then also see the approach taken in Budget 2021, where, for example, the Bantuan Prihatin Rakyat assistance is then now limited just to B40. Instead of automatic loan moratorium, it's targeted repayment assistance. And also even in terms of the wage subsidy, it's also just limited to tourism, retail being the worst affected. And that's the approach going forward. And so in the Prime Minister's speech on PERMEKASA, you then see that we want to move away from a blanket MCO. And that will hopefully help businesses then focus on being able to make hiring and investment decisions. We want to then be able then to have the economy more open, have more targeted assistance, really those to those really affected, as really part of an exit strategy. So in the diagrams, you saw a declining in terms of scope for assistance, but then increasing in terms of opening up of the economy, and as we transition then more towards structural reform. So that's why, as you even alluded in your opening segue, that really PERMEKASA then is a lot more targeted towards really the rakyat who are still affected, the poor, maybe those who have lost their jobs, and also more sectoral support targeted again to those sectors which are still struggling.
But there are many sectors now that are struggling. So basically what you have mentioned here is the initiative showed that the government has conducted deeper research into what has been affecting the economy amid the pandemic. So basically, when you're talking about sectors, a lot of sectors are affected, but how do you prioritize this?
Okay. But maybe again, taking a step back. So as I describe the evolution in terms of the government's approach, where the focus is on reopening the economy and in terms of then being a bit more targeted in terms of assistance, as Yang Berhormat Minister of Finance also has articulated, going forward, at least for 2021, we've really now gone to a stage where we've had five focus areas in terms of the economy for this year. So the more immediate one is in terms of really containing COVID, and I'll come back to that. The second one is really a focus towards driving the economic recovery. And the third really about boosting competitiveness, the fourth in terms of inclusiveness, and the fifth is about structural reform. So this is really the sequence of from short to medium to longer term. There is already the overall, plan and support that's provided in the budget 2021. Where PERMAI and now Permekasa come in is also slightly in recognition that when we were preparing budget 2021, we did not foresee, for example, the need to then, the spike in cases and the need for another MCO. And so really it's to complement this broader economic plan. And so you do have at one level, and you see it both a recurring theme in the budget, PERMAI and also Permekasa, the government being very consistent about ensuring that there is the broad economic support about ensuring. So in Permekasa's speech, Yang Berhormat Perdana Menteri starts off, the first part is really about controlling COVID. That's why we're spending more in terms of the vaccine. We want to then accelerate implementation of achieving herd immunity by December. That enables the opening up economy. Hence, the second focus area is really about then stimulating economic activity, whether it's increasing government spend, even small projects. Then that's the broad macro driving the economy. And I think that's the part that would then help everyone. But there's still obviously more targeted assistance. So targeted assistance to businesses, particularly tourism, retail, who are, I guess it's all relative. I mean, they're a lot more worse hit than some of the others. And then the last part is really about, there's still some rakyat, unemployment has been creeping up, and also some have lost income. So that's why we also need some additional targeted assistance for some segments.
Can we touch on that right after this break? Because we've just got to go for a very quick commercial break. We'll discuss more on, among other things, tax reforms to strengthen the country's revenue capacity. But before that, find us on Twitter and share your thoughts on the Permekasa stimulus package. You're still tuning in to Money Matters as we speak to the Finance Ministry's National Budget Director, Dato' Johan Mahmud Marikan. Dato', just very quickly, can I touch on what the Finance Minister has said in terms of funding Pemekasan? Because he has said that it will be from domestic borrowings. But a lot of people out there have also been asking that where is this domestic borrowings coming from?
Oh, Calvin, actually, we are a very blessed country. I think we've never really had that much of an issue with liquidity. I think partly because we still have a very strong financial system and capital markets, in terms of strong liquidity, and that's supported obviously by many of our institutions, whether it's, EPF, Co-op and the rest. So I think that has never been the issue about having to resort to international borrowings. Sometimes we do it for benchmarking purposes, but typically we've always had sufficient liquidity domestically to meet our requirements. And I guess the context arises, and maybe the question arises because of the need or what was announced by Yang Berhormat Minister of Finance on increasing the deficit. And maybe I need to explain that. When we obviously, as I mentioned, preparing the budget 2021, the assumptions were different. We did not expect that to be a need for another MCO spike in cases. But the situation has changed, and then government has recognized that there is a need, for example, for Pemekasan particularly, to really help to really transition out of the MCO and give a little bit more of an impetus towards economic recovery. I think government needs to provide more leadership in terms of helping to stimulate private sector. And that's why, as what was announced by Yang Berhormat Minister of Finance, there's been allowed for the deficit to increase from what was announced in Budget 2021 of 5.4% to around 6.0%. I think this is still below the deficit for 2020 of 6.2%. So we're still committed to fiscal consolidation. But I think allowing the deficit to rise, I think it's the government's recognition that there are still businesses and people facing difficulties. I think many again have asked, why do you need this Pemekasan again? And we said, look, yes, MCO 2.0 has been less of an impact compared to MCO 1. MCO 1 had 2 billion losses a day, MCO 2 had 300 million losses per day. But still, there are many sectors that are still operating at 50% capacity, your convention centres, your sports. And obviously tourism doesn't have the benefit of international tourists. And so, and we're also seeing a slight creeping up in terms of trend of unemployment. It's been rising from 4.7% back in October up to 40.9% in January. So certainly there's a need for government to intervene, and that's why the Ministry of Finance, or at least the government, has seen fit that we need to be able to spend more, hence Pemekasan.
Yeah. So adding on to what you said, because last month Bank Negara has also said that the government's fiscal deficit target of 5.4% in 2021 is still intact. And like you mentioned just now, the Finance Minister said that the implementation of the Pemekasan stimulus package had widened the projected fiscal deficit from 5.4% to 6%. So do you think this latest projection of 6% can be intact for the rest of the year, or will there be changes?
The one thing we've learned about COVID is never say never. But I think on a serious note, the Minister of Finance, I think, has given his commitment that the government is still committed to fiscal consolidation. I think we still recognise that that's important to maintain in terms of confidence and also financial prudence in terms of management of the economy. And therefore, that's why it's indicated that the deficit this year will be lower than last year. And that's something that we can manage, and obviously the Ministry of Finance will certainly work to ensure that we work within our abilities to achieve that. But I think at this point in time, the priorities are really still, as mentioned, we need to, at the end of the day, contain COVID. That's really, and hence the priority towards increasing the spend on vaccine, enabling the reopening of economy so that really the private sector can then invest, hire, people getting jobs and earn income again. That's really the focus, and we have to do whatever necessary to ensure that really we do achieve that recovery for the well-being of all our rakyat.
Okay, let's look at the short term, especially the next couple of months. What are the key factors that will determine the need for further economic stimulus packages?
Okay, well, we've already, as you said, already done 6 packages, and we certainly, so I think, as mentioned, we have this broader economic frame, and we have the 6 Rs. And as earlier alluded to, as I said, as we open up more of the economy, we should have to be able to transition towards reducing our, almost an exit strategy on cash assistance and at least be a bit more targeted to do. So we should really be transitioning more to structural reform. And I think the next stage really, rather than talking about the next package, I think the government really wants to focus more on, for example, the 12 Malaysia Plan. There's some areas, Minister of Finance alluded to, perhaps even the GLC transformation is another area. We want to see what more can we do in terms of really transitioning away from the more immediate, focusing on COVID, economic recovery, to then really trying to see what more can we do to boost our competitiveness, what more can we do in terms of ensuring that there's structural reform so that we then are also as part of moving up in terms of being a higher income nation. I think that's part of a broader strategy which we need to see through as we transition out. So I guess we need to really continue our efforts. I think that's why we always are engaging. So for example, the Safe at Work agenda which was announced, we need to ensure that all of Malaysia, private sector included, comes on board with the agenda, really focusing on SOP so that we really can get, if I can say that, a resumption to normalcy. Resumption to normalcy in terms of the economy, resumption to normalcy in terms of our jobs and even our daily lives. And if we can do that, then we can focus on the next stage, really, of structural reform. So I think our plan at this moment in time, if it goes to plan, is really not too much thinking about the next package, but really being able to then, contain the COVID numbers, being able to open up the economy and then focus on the next stage of structural reform.
Now you mentioned about the resumption to normalcy. So in your opinion, are we on track to getting back to some sort of normalcy?
I think certainly I think people are a lot more used in terms of SOPs. I know there's some complaints about the higher fines, 10,000, but certainly that's a key part, because if we want to open up the economy, we really need to have much better compliance. But as I mentioned, it's going to be a bit more of a data approach. We want to move away. We don't want there to be another recurrence of an MCO. That's why the Prime Minister spoke about now better use of data analytics. 10% of the clusters of COVID contribute about 85% of the cases, and so perhaps going forward we'll be a bit more targeted in terms of enhanced MCO. As soon as the cases come, we just contain it there, so that at least the rest of the economy can continue to run. So I think that's where we're trying to be focused in terms of managing that balance in terms of COVID and the economy, and Makassar, I guess, is setting out part of that strategy.
Right. Dr. Johan, hold that thought. We've just got to go for another short break, and we'll be back right after this. Thank you for staying with us. We're with the National Budget Director, Dato' Johan Mahmud Marikan. Now, Dato', the Finance Ministry is currently undertaking a study on how to widen Malaysia's revenue base. So with the current narrowed fiscal room, what options are there for tax reforms to strengthen the country's revenue capacity?
I think, as you would have heard, Yang Berhormat Minister of Finance also recently mentioned, whilst obviously we as Ministry of Finance will always continue to look how can we obviously enhance the revenue base, ensure that we have a more efficient and effective tax system. Now is certainly not the time for introducing any new taxes. I think he made it very clear, certainly as the country is really trying at a stage of recovering from the COVID crisis, it is certainly not the time for any new taxes. In fact, if anything, you would have seen that the focus of some of the tax measures that you've seen in the packages that were announced last year, the Budget 2021, even the one in Purwakarta, the focus is one on really alleviating those who are then still affected. So we have seen for the tourism sector, there are even some like for federal territories we're waiving the entertainment tax, so cinemas now without tax, or theme parks, and also then extending, for example, the service tax exemption for hotels. Really various tax incentives to then basically try to ease it for the affected sectors. The other focus areas in terms of how to then boost investments. As I mentioned, in terms of the 5 focus areas for the economy by the government this year, one of it was about boosting competitiveness. And so one key area, again, how do you then promote domestic investments and also FDI? So what was put in past packages and even Budget 2021, there's key focus about how to get some business to relocate. So looking at our tax incentives, are they effective in terms of bringing the higher value added investments? There's been some talk about reform in the sense that some of our tax incentives tend to be more weighted towards the capital expenditure or big capital investments that are being made. Perhaps one of the areas of reform we're looking at is how to then more incentivize based on the high value jobs that are being created. So these are probably some of the more I would say, priority right now, as I said, prioritizing on the economic recovery and really how can taxes then in terms of helping those affected and also boosting trade investments.
So looking at the strategies basically to implement, because there's a lot of talk out there that the GST has always been an issue that has always been brought up by not just people in the government, by the man in the street as well. So basically, what are your thoughts on that?
I think as what the Minister of Finance said, now's not time for new taxes. Obviously, we have, always will continue to ensure that we are ready to introduce better taxes, improve our tax system, but now it's not time for new taxes. Now we're looking really how do we then optimize, as I was explaining, in terms of our tax options, in terms of measures that we can do to ease the pain for affected sectors, and also what we can do to then enhance in terms of attracting investments, which really then will help support the growth and economic recovery momentum.
Right. Now, looking at the debt to GDP ratio, a quick check on the nation's economic output to its debt levels. Is there a possibility that the debt limit be raised again? And also, what is the tolerance level of the Finance Ministry? I mean, how much more can we borrow?
I think when the government had last year introduced this COVID fund to really then provide the ability to then respond and support the packages to respond to the COVID crisis, at that time the debt, statutory debt limit was raised from 55% to 60%. We are still within that ceiling, and even with what YB Minister of Finance had said in terms of allowing for the fiscal deficit to rise from 5.4% to 6%, even at the 6% level, we are still within the 60% limit. So at this point in time, the government, the Ministry of Finance, we're still working within that ceiling, and this is something that we're committed to.
Right. Now, looking at expenditure that the government is going to basically look into subsidies and various issues as that as well. How's the government going to rationalize the expenditure?
I think as mentioned again, the immediate priority, and it's articulated in Purwakarta, is that Purwakarta is almost this transitional bridge. We're transitioning out of MCO into its economic recovery. So again, the priority is how do we boost economic activity, how do we help affected businesses and also affected people. And so as was even specifically mentioned in Yang Berhormat Prime Minister's Purwakarta speech, the government now is actually starting to subsidize petrol again. The government has announced a ceiling price of RM2.05 for RON 95. at the current high oil prices, we're already subsidizing, I think, 30 cents per litre. And at those levels, actually, we will need an additional 3 billion to cover the subsidies for both petrol and diesel. And so that's something that we want to make sure that we look after the well-being of the rakyat. We want to ensure that we focus right now on economic recovery.
Right. Dr. Johan, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thank you again for joining us on Money Matters.
My pleasure.
It's our pleasure to have you on the program with us.
Thanks.
Please join us again next week, same day and time, for another in-depth discussion with more money insights that matter. Until then, I'm Zahir Kelvin Ong Abdullah. Thank you for watching and stay safe.